Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Mike Lew. Mike is a psychotherapist and the author of Victims No Longer, the classic guide for men recovering from sexual child abuse. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Natasha.
So I'm going to start with something I read online. According to the 2010 CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, there are estimated to be more than 25 million male victims of sexual violence of all forms in the United States, and millions of them never come forward to disclose the abuse they experienced. So clearly there's a huge impact on many levels that ripples out, but I'd like you to talk about some of the impact, but also why it's so hard for us to relate to or to validate males being victims.
Well, I think across the board, the statistics are problematic. That, yes, those are huge and shocking numbers, but the most conservative estimates that are agreed upon by researchers and clinicians are that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 females will be sexually abused before the age of 18, and approximately 1 in 6 males. Now, these are conservative estimates because they don't take into account the numbers of people who never disclose, who disclose and aren't believed. And once someone is not believed, they're unlikely to keep talking about it. So it's a very difficult situation. In our culture, we don't really traditionally have room for males as victims. We've considered that only females are victims and only males are victimizers. So for a man or a boy to be victimized, he is seen and often sees himself as something other than, read less than, a man. So he's less likely to disclose.
So, there was this period of time where there was the whole thing about the church and the priests and whatever else, and some of that has been addressed and some of it has kind of dissipated. It's no longer in the news. But it still impacts these people for the rest of their lives. And then everybody they come in contact with, their intimate relationships, their families, their self-esteem, how they show up in the world. What would you, I guess the most significant thing is, what would you say to someone who has been victimized and hasn't come forward and just kind of lives with it?
Well, I believe that isolation is the enemy of recovery, that abuse takes place in isolation, and recovery has to happen in the company of other people. But it's tricky because isolation can feel like safety. If I'm by myself, no one's going to hurt me. But it isn't safety. It allows the old abuse messages to repeat like a tape loop without anything or anyone contradicting them. So I would say, when you can, disclose. And if the person you disclose to can't hear it or minimizes it, disclose to someone else. Find someone who can listen to you with respect, believe you, and treat the information as an act of trust, as an important disclosure. I have been doing this work. I've been working with male survivors now. I'm well into my 4th decade doing it. And things have changed. Things have improved. Not as quickly as I would like, and certainly not as quickly as most of the survivors would like. But things have gotten better. In part, I think, because of the public nature of a lot of disclosures, including the Roman Catholic Church in Boston and the wonderful work that the Boston Globe Spotlight team did in breaking that story. Also, because for good or ill, we're a celebrity-driven society. And I think that each time a celebrity discloses an abuse history, it gives others, ordinary people, permission to speak up. So more and more that's happening. And it's happening to good effect.
Yes. So one of the things that in your book you talk about, the question was what it takes to heal in recovery and what is recovery. And you defined it as recovery is the freedom to make choices in your life that aren't determined by the abuse. So I'm assuming most victims then self-define by those incidents.
Well, it's tricky to talk about most victims because, as you said earlier, we're talking about millions of people
Yeah.
who are abused in many different ways at different ages, some by a man or men, some by a woman or women, some by both, some with violence attached, and some with seduction or bribery. Some one incident, others many over a period of years. So the idea that one size would fit all on any level just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, but given all the differences, there are also a huge number of commonalities. There's a lot of overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why it's so important for male survivors to meet other male survivors is that they stop feeling so alien. They stop feeling as though as though he were the only one that this was done to. I've heard men say, I heard my story coming out of someone else's mouth. And that is such a contradiction to the alienation and isolation. It's massively important, whether that's in a group, a therapy group, a peer support group, a workshop, an online forum. Breaking out of that isolation is essential.
Yeah. So I think I wanted to read something that, I'm sure you've changed the names, but somebody wrote this about incest, and it was one of the male survivors. And he says, incest is the story of silence. The silence of the innocent, of the vulnerable, of the trusting, of the sensitive, of the sweet, of the human. That silence alone thunders condemnation of the weak, sick, pathetic, cruel, and vicious individuals who destroy the expression of innocence, vulnerability, trust, sensitivity, sweetness, and humanity in another human being. This remains true even if our abusers were not the totally depraved individuals that some of our numbers suffered under. Incest is not only a reprehensible crime of violence against the person of a child, but also a crime against the future of that child. I found that tremendously moving and compelling, and it kind of says it all in one place. So again, it is a crime against the future of that child. So what's part of the journey has them start to create their own future?
Well, this varies with the individual. I'd say the common factors are, first of all, time and distance from the original abuse, sometimes physical distance. When I started doing this work, I was in Boston, and 100% of my clients came from other parts of the country.
Wow.
Saying things like, oh, I couldn't do this in Colorado. My family lives there, or my abuser is still in Minnesota. And I'm sure that the West Coast was full of people from the East Coast who had to do the same thing. So there's that time and distance from the abuse, and safety, physical safety. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that it's possible to heal while one is being abused. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's resources. Mm-hmm. Sometimes what triggers the work is a life change, whether it's someone getting married, someone becoming a parent, and wanting to make sure that they don't inflict the results of the abuse on their own children. Sometimes what triggers it is very minor. It can be a line in a song or a scene in a film. And it all comes flooding back, and people say, I need to deal with this. For some, for many, it's that they've tried everything else. They've tried to drink their way through it. They've tried to drug their way through it. Sexual promiscuity, work, gambling, all sorts of things. And the pain is still there. Eating disorders. And so kicking and screaming, they say, okay, I guess I have to do this. I don't want to.
Yeah.
But I've tried everything else and I'm still in pain. Now, this doesn't mean it's any less courageous an act. Going into recovery is hugely courageous. It's taking on decades of pain, decades of shame, decades of fear, memories that nobody wants to look at, but they feel that they have to, that the only way out of this is through it. And I have huge respect for anyone willing to take that on.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, or a few years ago, I interviewed Mark Crawford, who is the executive director of SNAP in New Jersey, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. And one of the things that he said is that children will never tell, even if we tell them to tell. And that's part of the dilemma, is generally the abusers are manipulators and threatening and intimidating. But again, is there anything we can do as adults that would make that more possible?
Well, much as I like and respect Mark, and I think he's heroic in his life, I don't completely agree with the idea that children will never tell. I think that children will tell if it's truly safe for them to tell, and if they can overcome the abusers trying to keep them silent. But what frequently happens when a child discloses is that the adult doesn't believe them, blames them, shames them, scolds them. Oh, how could you say that about dear old Uncle Joe, you bad child? Well, or father so-and-so. A child doesn't have to hear that response too many times to know that it's not safe to disclose, often for decades, sometimes forever. So when parents ask me, what can I do to make sure that my child will come to me if something is being done to him or her, I'll say, you've got to believe them. It's got to be okay for them to come to you with anything. And this means anything, not just what's comfortable for you to hear. So even if you hate the idea, if your child comes to you and says, for example, that they're gay, that has to be okay. Or that they're sexually active, that has to be okay. Because if they can't come to you with this, when something like abuse is present, if they can't come to you with something smaller, they're not going to come to you with something bigger. So you have to accept even the most uncomfortable things if you want your kids to disclose to you. Otherwise, you will not get the information.
Yeah, and and I think kids are always have, even if they have the most open parents, there's always that fear of getting caught by mom or dad or whatever, that kind of fear of the adults. But I suppose that...
Which is often reinforced by the abuser.
Yeah.
And sometimes the abuser is mom or dad.
Yes. So I want to segue into that because there's something I don't understand and that find it unfathomable, and maybe you, with your experience, can kind of add some light to that. So there's one parent who is the abuser, and then there's the other silent parent. Now, sometimes they don't know, but my guess is very often the other parent knows and stays silent. What is that all about?
Often when a survivor first gets in touch with his outrage, and I'm saying his because we're talking about male survivors here, but it's equally true for female survivors, that when they get in touch with their outrage about what was done to them, initially it's not unusual for the anger to be expressed not at the abusing parent, but at the complicit, non-protective parent.
Yeah.
Because the question becomes, did you know? Mm-hmm. If you knew, why didn't you do something? Mm-hmm. And if you didn't know, why didn't you? Because it was your job to know.
And what's your theory on that? And I know there's no one answer fits all, but what is that silence of the other parent?
I think there are many factors. One is disbelief, not wanting to believe that it's happening. Another is fear of destroying the family, even though abuse effectively destroys the family. Sometimes it's fear, what will happen if mom or dad leaves? Sometimes it's just the traditional control by a patriarchal or a matriarchal family system. Society in general doesn't reward whistleblowers. Even if that whistleblower is an abused child, it's not unusual for the system to do whatever it can to get the status quo back in place, to force the kid to play his role as assigned, or to eject the offender, the offending child, in quotes, from the family so that things can go on as normal.
Wow. There was a former Miss America who, perfect family, 4 daughters. I actually have been in communication with her about doing a show, but her story, and she's in her 70s now, I think, but her story is very compelling in that, again, this was the perfect American family, and she was Miss America. But I think it was her who said one night she heard her mother's footsteps coming down the hall when her father was in her room. And she thought, oh, thank God, finally. And her mother stopped and turned back and walked away.
I hear stories like that all the time, that when a child is being abused by a priest, another priest comes into the room and then sees what's going on and leaves. So it's not just within the family, but that sort of cowardice, that sort of sacrifice of a child to the abuse is outrageous. It's unconscionable.
See, the thing that's puzzling for me, and I know you're not the answer man, but it's just the idea that, and so there's some kind of underlying psyche that, maybe many components, but the idea, I think, is that it's not that damaging. I think is that part of the component, like, oh, the kid will get over it if somebody else sees it?
Well, we expect boys to be little men.
Mm-hmm.
And we expect men to be able to handle any situation. Mm-hmm. And, we raise men to be problem solvers, to be fixers. And again, if they can't handle it, they become lessened, diminished. They become seen as something less than a real man. And sometimes that handle anything is translated as react violently to a situation, which is not the best of solutions either. I guess, one of the things that I want to make sure that we don't run out of time on
Yes, please.
is the question of recovery. Because the most frequent question I get from males is recovery possible? And I've been doing this work for many decades now. And my answer is an unequivocal yes. Recovery is possible. I know this to be a fact because I've now worked with thousands of male survivors in many countries, in many situations, and I see many, many creative, powerful, courageous, intelligent, capable men actively working toward recovery and making changes in their lives. It's not quick, it's not easy, there's no quick fix or simple answer. One size doesn't fit everyone, and life never gets perfect, but no one's life is perfect.
Right.
But things do get better. What you said earlier about the abuse not determining every waking moment. This happens. People feel good about themselves. People stop wishing they were someone else. People are able to take on make career choices that aren't based on feeling less than. They're able to establish healthy intimacy, both sexual and non-sexual friendships. This is a huge change from the isolation, and it is possible, but it doesn't happen easily or quickly, and it doesn't happen. There's no way to go over, around, or under the pain. You have to go through it to get out the other side.
Yeah, and I assume there's no timeline.
That's the second most frequent question that I get asked is how long will this take? And I'm not being facetious when I say my best answer is it will take longer than you would like, but not as long as you fear.
Yeah, and when you describe that, like living a healthy lifestyle, developing intimate relationships and friendships, getting a job based on what good self-esteem rather than settling for less because you don't deserve it. Coming out of that context, that occurs as miraculous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I don't use the word miracle lightly, but I do see these miracles all the time.
Yeah. And again, so there are people, and there was something you wrote, because there are people who still will not want to come forward, or they think they've got it handled. There's some, and you wrote, if you have been abused, you're already engaged in the struggle. And so, it may feel like it's just part of your DNA, but there it is. So I would assume that, like you say, if again, you could live your life kind of in that narrow path of who you know yourself to be, or you can take that courageous journey.
Yeah, and nobody does it a minute before they're ready. I would say easily a good half of the phone calls and emails I get are from partners of survivors, close friends of survivors, close relatives, wanting me to fix their survivor partner. And I don't know any way to coerce or manipulate someone into recovery. People have to be ready. And once they're ready, they will somehow find a way to take the step. When I first started doing this work, there were very, very few resources anywhere for male survivors. There aren't enough now, but there are a lot more than there used to be. There are national organizations, there are local groups, some of them survivor-generated, others by professionals, but there are lots of resources available, and it's possible for people to do things anonymously at first. They can read a book, they can go online and look at a website without having to commit themselves to any public disclosure. That's often a good start for guys who want to begin their recovery.
And that's what your book is geared toward.
That's what I'm hoping, yeah.
Yeah, the male survivor, and you said, and their families. So
And those who care about them.
yeah, or the
whether
people,
that's professionals or
right.
friends or family.
Yeah. So we've got 2 minutes left. Is there anything specific you want to say? Any message you want feel that is compelling, more compelling than the others?
Just two quick lines. One is, if the way to approach a survivor is with complete respect. And I've found that regardless of the culture or where in the world, when people are met with respect, they will respond. To survivors, there is hope. Things do get better. Stay with it. Don't give up. There are resources, there are people who understand, and people who care.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And you know, I've met people who are survivors of concentration camps. And somehow, whatever journeys they choose to take, they have done some healing. And I think in some ways, someone who has been sexually abused, the experience in some ways could be very similar, but just know that there could be life after that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are engaged in a struggle that we have to win to make sure that we stop treating children as property.
Thank
Because
you.
once we treat children as property, we can justify anything.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And on that note, we have to end. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Natasha. It was my pleasure.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.